Console, your podcast destination for navigating your career journey. We will talk about how to plan and manage your career, and you can benefit from the real life experience of professionals. Wherever you are in your career journey, this show will help you move forward with confidence. I am Paddy, and I am joined by my co host Praveen, and each of us has more than 20 years of experience working across industries, functions, and geographies. On today's episode, we are going to talk about how to deal with conflicts at the workplace. So, what is a workplace conflict? A conflict is an escalation of a disagreement. Disagreement means two or more individuals have a different point of view on how to deal with a situation or issue at hand. And it is very common for these differences to exist at the workplace, and most differences are in fact resolved amicably. But if such disagreements carry on for an extended period of time, or if they are not resolved amicably, it escalates into a conflict. For example, an organization might be looking to acquire a company or launch a new product line, and two senior executives may have different views on how to proceed. That is a disagreement. And if both executives are willing to work it out, the disagreement can be resolved. However, if both of them dig into their positions, that escalates into a conflict. So, a conflict is usually characterized by three factors. First, there is a disagreement between the people or parties involved. Second, the relevant parties are either unwilling or unable to figure out a way to address the differences. And third, the inability to bridge differences negatively impacts their working relationship as well as their productivity and effectiveness.
Let's now talk about the different types of conflict and the reason behind some of these conflicts. Often, when people think about conflicts, they think about conflicts between individuals. But these are just one type of conflict. The conflict can be between individuals, groups, or between organizations. Conflicts between individuals primarily happens because of different personality types or different goals and motivations. You may have, for example, a long-standing disagreement about a particular project and how to go about it with your coworker. That is an example of a conflict between individuals. In many workplaces, you would see conflicts across groups. For example, you would see sales team in conflict with operations or delivery teams. Sales teams are measured on revenue targets, but operations and delivery teams have other priorities and metrics. Often, sales teams want to sell no matter what, and the operations team sometimes don't want to do more business because they're not measured by it. This is almost conflict by design. Similarly, there can be conflicts between organizations. This could be a conflict between customers and suppliers. The expectations of the customers are not met by the supplier, but the supplier argues then that what has been agreed upon or contracted has already been provided. Let's say they could not find a common ground. One thing to remember is that at the end of it, at whatever level the conflict happens, the actors in this sort of grand play are individuals. We're all emotional creatures and not just impassionate automatons. Hence, these conflicts do affect us as individuals, and we need to learn on how to be passionate about the cause, but not to get too personal. Now let's talk about some of the common reasons for a conflict. But before going into that, let's look at the common reasons for disagreements in the workplace. The first could be that you do not have full access to information. For example, two managers are evaluating the performance of an employee. One manager feels the employee is doing a great job, and the other manager feels the employee isn't up to the mark. This can happen because the employee did great on one of the projects and he really did not do well on the other. There's a disagreement because neither manager has access to all the facts. One would hope that once they get access to the facts, they can resolve the disagreement. The second common reason for a disagreement is difference in expectations. Let's say take the previous example. Let's say the employee performed at the same level of competence on both projects. Even then, two managers can disagree on the employee performance. If one manager, say, had higher expectations from the employee, another manager does not. There's a difference in expectation. But the bottom line is this also can be resolved amicably. The next sort of reason for disagreement are competing priorities. In some instances, individuals and organizations might have competing priorities or goals. For example, a line manager might want to push for an early promotion of the team member to recognize his work. However, the HR manager might push back on it because it will have ramifications to other people in other groups and teams. The last reason could be more around misunderstanding or miscommunication. There is, when you think about it, there's so much communication going around at the workplace. And some of this is bound to be misunderstood. For example, a manager wants a team to send him a report as soon as possible, ASAP, which could mean right away, tomorrow, or by end of the week. If the team doesn't interpret it the way the manager meant it, it can lead to a situation where the manager feels the team is not responsive. Again, none of these disagreements have to escalate into a conflict. Disagreements can be resolved amicably, and even if they cannot be resolved, we can find a way not to let them escalate into a conflict and negatively affect the relationship. I like to think that disagreements are intellectual, whereas conflicts are emotional. Disagreements spiral into a conflict when emotion comes to play. This can happen in several ways. People want to win that argument at any cost, or they suspect the other people's motives, or they fear shame and embarrassment if they back down from their previous position. And we're all emotional beings, so it's impossible to keep emotions out of our interaction. So it helps to pause and reflect on our reactions and responses in a conflict situation.
So are conflicts bad then? Well, firstly, we differentiated between disagreements and a conflict. And disagreements are not bad at all. And in fact, it's good to have some disagreements and differences in the workplace because it encourages diversity in views and thoughts. But if disagreements frequently escalate into a conflict, that is a worrying sign because it indicates an inability to embrace those differences or deal with them in a mature manner. And frequent conflicts are unhealthy because it can result in poor or delayed decisions. It damages relationships and can erode trust among the people involved. Of course, like we said, we are emotional beings, so some disagreements will escalate into conflicts, and that's inevitable. Sometimes even a full-blown conflict can yield positive side effects. People probably learn more about each other in a conflict situation than otherwise. And it's not surprising to see that some of the long-lasting professional relationships that we form might have actually begun in a conflict. Is there a way you can avoid conflict? Should you avoid conflict? Let's differentiate between preventing a conflict versus avoiding a conflict. Preventing a conflict means that you are able to stop the disagreement or resolve the disagreement before it escalates into a conflict. Whereas avoiding a conflict means you're either ignoring a conflict that exists or you're shying away from dealing with it. Preventing a conflict is great, and you should do it if you can, because that involves resolving differences in a mature and a professional manner. But if you do find yourself in the midst of a conflict, you should recognize that not all conflicts need to be resolved, but neither can you run away from every conflict. A person who is always taking on a conflict can come across as someone who's difficult to work with. But at the same time, if you're not ready to air your disagreements and you come across as someone who is easily pliable, you can be seen as soft, and that can affect your credibility and maybe even your career progression. It is important to find this balance. It is not easy by any means, but it is important to find a balance of when to deal with a conflict. And this requires a value judgment. I would say that if the issue is important to you, or if the conflict is negatively impacting either your productivity or that of the team or the organization, you must deal with it. But if the issue is relatively minor, you can let it go. But the bottom line here is some conflicts can be avoided, some conflicts have to be dealt with, and it takes experience and judgment to identify when to let a conflict go versus when to face it head on and resolve it. I also sometimes get this question: is escalating a conflict to leadership or management a good way of resolving a conflict? Let me say this: there are disagreements at all levels, and it is expected that people at all levels do what they can to work out these disagreements at their level. So it's not healthy to escalate every conflict to your manager. It should definitely not be your first resort. Trying to resolve a conflict with your colleague or a peer or a stakeholder is also an exercise in confidence building. So you should try to resolve it at your level before escalating it to your management. Be warned though, usually if you escalate a conflict to your manager, the first question he or she might ask you is, what have you already done to resolve it?
Let's talk about a common behavior in the workplace that is actually a symptom of a conflict, and that is passive aggressive behavior. Passive aggressive behavior is when you're not directly aggressive, but indirectly you're being very aggressive. Often, as passive aggressive behavior, the parties engage in postponing, sulking, cynicism, sarcasm, etc. Often, it can be due to, say, an unresolved conflict or a conflict that is not explicitly stated by the individuals, but is sort of simmering beneath the surface. Let me give you an example. Let's say the leadership makes a decision on how to go about a new product or a new market, and people are assigned various roles. Passive aggressive behavior is when, let's say, someone really doesn't like the task, but he doesn't voice his concerns openly. Instead, he just keeps postponing the deliverables from his end, or there is no actual commitment to the project, and he tries to sabotage the project. This is often very common in workplaces, and partly because in most workplaces, people are inhibited in showing their emotions. Now let's talk a little bit about how to deal with this passive aggressive behavior. First and foremost, check if this behavior is a pattern. One or two instances of postponing or venting, it doesn't count really as passive aggressive behavior. But if there is a repeated behavior along the same lines, then it can be termed as passive aggressive behavior. Now, how do you tackle this situation? First is you can be open with the communication with the person and allow him to air out his concerns. Often, passive aggressive behavior are due to underlying factors such as insecurity about the job or really not liking what that person is assigned or what that person is doing. Let's say if you are his manager, you definitely need to get to the root of the problem. Often a direct line of questioning or interrogation won't help. Confronting them directly right at the onset will make them more defensive. You need to approach a little more tactfully and figure out what is causing this particular behavior. Even in the case of a coworker, you still need to have an open communication with them. And sometimes all they need It's just a sympathetic shoulder. But if the behavior really persists, and if it is really affecting the performance of the team, you need to call it out. And whenever and wherever appropriate, you need to escalate it to your manager.
Let's now talk about how you can navigate inter-team conflicts or conflicts that occur between teams. As we discussed earlier in the show, conflicts between teams often take place because they have competing goals or priorities. For example, the goal of the finance organization might be to optimize spending and budgets, but the product management group wants more funding to build out the new product. This is again almost conflict by design. As an organization, you can minimize these types of conflicts by openly sharing the objectives and priorities of the teams with everyone who is involved, and also by making sure that these objectives and priorities are aligned with the overall goals of the organization. If the goal of the organization is to conserve cash this year, it may not be the best time to launch new products. But if you're a manager who is leading a team and you find that your team is in a conflict with another team within your organization, this is the time to step up and take ownership of the situation. And here are some things that you can do to positively influence the situation and try to diffuse the conflict. First, ask yourself, are the expectations clearly understood across the teams? Or are there any gaps in understanding? If you can work with the other team to openly communicate your goals and your expectations and try to understand their goals and their expectations, a lot of times that can point to what is the reason for the conflict. So trying to understand what priorities are driving the other team can help you better empathize with their mindset and with their goals. As they say, be in the other person's shoes and try to visualize their thought process and their thinking, and that will help you identify why these conflicts might be occurring between teams. Again, you may not agree with everything that the other team has to say, but at least it has given you a better understanding of where they are coming from, and having that common ground is a great place to be when trying to resolve conflicts. What about personal conflicts then? What are some ways to resolve or navigate personal conflicts? I would say the first step in trying to resolve a personal conflict or a conflict with another individual is to resist the temptation to judge that person as good or bad. Because once you make that value judgment, it can be very difficult to backtrack from that position. If we make a judgment, we often tend to look at those behaviors and those actions that reinforce and rationalize the decision that we already made. So if we start by making that decision or ascribing a motive to them, it is going to be very hard for us to remain neutral or open-minded. So instead of making that judgment, try to understand where the other person is coming from. What were his or her past experiences? What are their motivations? What are their fears? That usually helps you get an insight into their thought process. And once again, you don't have to agree with them, you don't have to agree with their ideas, but you now have a better appreciation of their views. The second tip that I would share when trying to resolve a conflict with an individual is do not make it about who is right, because usually at this point in the conflict, there is often way too much emotion involved, and neither party is often able to admit or accept that they are wrong. And trying to show that you are right might actually make the conflict worse, even if you are actually right. Instead, I would say take a step back and diffuse the immediate tension in the situation. And then try to have an open discussion to recalibrate what the goals are and how best to achieve them. In my experience, taking a step back to calm down the immediate situation and then opening the discussion up again to try and understand what is the goal that we are working towards can often help resolve some of these tricky personal conflicts that we see at the workplace.
Thank you for listening to our show. We wish you all the very best in your career journey. Please stay tuned for our next episodes. This is Paddy and Praveen signing off from Career Console.